Bidding wars, record sale prices, first-time buyers simply priced out. The housing market in and around Ontario's capital city has been so hot for so long that the provincial government recently brought in several new measures to try to cool things off. Did the province make the right moves to get that job done? Let's ask. Craig Alexander, Senior Vice President, Chief Economist at the Conference Board of Canada. Cynthia Holmes, Founding Chair of the Real Estate Management Department at Ryerson University. Ben Myers, Senior VP, Market Research and Analytics, Fortress Real Developments. And Diane Dyson, Director of Research and Public Policy at Wood Green Community Services. Great to have all of you around our table tonight for a timely discussion here on TVO. And before we go any further, let's look at some of what is in the so-called Fair Housing Plan that the Ontario government just unveiled, and then we'll come back and chat. Sheldon, if you would, this graphic, please. The province has introduced a 15% tax for people who are not citizens or permanent residents of Canada. That's on new home purchases. It has expanded rent controls now to all rental units, not just the ones built before 1991. There was a post-91 building exemption. That's now gone. It introduced a rebate of $125 million over 5 years for new purpose-built rental buildings. It is opening the door for municipalities to be able to tax homes that are sitting vacant. Province also said it would work with municipalities to encourage the supply of new housing. It's going to partner with the Canadian Revenue Agency to make sure that the correct income and sales taxes are being paid on property purchases. And finally, under the growth plan, it's going to work with municipalities to make sure all types of housing, including condos and townhouses, are built. Okay, let's open up to thank you for the wide shot there. Show of hands, please. Who thinks this is going to dramatically do what it says it's going to do, namely chill the housing market in and around Toronto? Hands up.
Well, it isn't going to be dramatic.
Not dramatic.
All right, we're counting
and
already.
I'm just praying.
You're praying. That's not a hand up, that's a prayer. And you're saying not dramatic. So essentially we have 4 votes for no here. Craig, what do you mean not you think maybe but not dramatic? In which case, is that a failure?
Well, I think it's going to have a knee-jerk reaction in cooling price behavior in the near term. But what we've tended to see in markets is that when you make regulatory changes, the market adjusts to it. So I think that this is going to have an impact in the short run, and then I think the market will adjust to those realities and continue to have price growth. The question is going to be how strong is that price growth, and then the second dimension to this is the supply side of the equation, because ultimately, I think what will cool the market is supply, but it takes a long time for additional supply to come on the market. It could take a year or more to come on. So I think some of these measures are designed to temper the exceptionally rapid price growth that was not supported by economic fundamentals in the near term. So it's actions trying to temper demand in the near term. Ultimately, I think it's a supply story that actually will resolve the issue.
More on all of these as we go. Go ahead.
I would add that I'm hopeful partly because a large part of the remedies that are being brought in are about controlling the price for people that are already living in rental housing, and that is half of the people that live in the Greater Toronto area. The other part that's hopeful inside here is that they also have introduced a series of, they recognize that there are other issues to be addressed, and they've set up advisory panels to continue to look at it. So this is not this is, I think, the first shot at it. It's not the last shot.
Cynthia, do you think this is going to tamp down prices in the GTHA?
If they do, it will be inadvertent, and because of other broad discussions like we're having today and just a lot of focus on it that affects people's behaviors. But one of the most dramatic policies, for example, the foreign buyers tax, to my mind, there's just not enough foreign buyers who are speculating in the market, so that this tax is not going to sufficiently reduce demand to change the fundamental interaction between demand and supply that we're seeing right now.
Dan, how about you?
I think it's going to have, I agree with Craig, it's going to have a, just a minor blip right now as people say, this is uncertain, I don't know what's going to happen, I'm going to pull back, I'm not going to buy right now. But in the long run, it's essentially a supply issue. We have this massive increase in demand. Part of that is the fact that we've added 219,000 new people to Ontario over the last year. So, the highest growth that we've seen since 1986. So what you would expect is to see higher completions, higher starts in the marketplace, and we're not seeing that. We're seeing a similar level of starts that we've seen over the past, 15 to 20 years, and a lot of those are now condominiums. We've seen this major switch. So we're actually building 26% less square footage in the market than we did 15 years ago. So it's totally distorting the market because a lot of people, you have kids, you start a family, you want that single family home, and there's just none of that available out there to buy.
I don't know if you can tell this already, but this obviously was announced, what was it, a week or two ago, something like that. Has there been a reaction by the marketplace yet that you can discern?
Well, I'm looking at the TREB numbers, and there's
Toronto Real Estate Board.
Toronto Real Estate Board, huge increase in the supply that's been added, the listings in the marketplace. So I definitely think there's some reaction from folks saying, well, I need to beat these measures or get my home onto the market before people kind of see if this is actually going to cool the market. But in terms of new home projects, we launched a project on Wellington Street, downtown condominium with our partner Brad Lamb on a Saturday after the Thursday announcement. Lineups out the door, people banging to trying to get in. We have a site in Woodbridge, again, same thing. People lined up, all the appointments taking up. Feverish pace of new home sales. So on the new home side, it certainly has, but on the resale, seeing anecdotally that it's people are holding back offers a bit. So we'll see how it ultimately turns out.
Cynthia, let's follow up on this. Governments obviously are elected to make decisions, and the decision that they have made, in their wisdom, is to sort of do what they call a suite of options or policies across a sort of a broad swath of different issues in order to try to tamp things down. We haven't heard, at least among you four, that anybody's expecting boffo success from this, in which case, should they have more laser-like focused on one thing in particular as opposed to this broad range of things?
I think it's very difficult to craft policies that can have an immediate effect on the housing market. Fundamentally, delivering additional supply takes time. And so any policies that are put in place to encourage new supply, and we did see some of these, they may have some positive effects in the sense that, they're trying to streamline the planning process. So that might have a positive effect, but it's just not going to happen immediately. And it's very difficult to imagine which kind of policies can be implemented that could have this kind of successful, strong impact right off the bat.
Craig, tell us why people who don't live in the Greater Toronto Hamilton area should be concerned about what's happening in this market as opposed to in 95% of the rest of the province where they live.
Well, the first thing you have to emphasize is that the challenge in the housing market is really around the greater Golden Horseshoe area. We tend to talk about it as if it's a Toronto issue. It's not just a Toronto issue. It's Toronto and then all of the commuter corridors that plug into the Toronto market.
So we're talking Waterloo, Hamilton, all the way around St. Catharines, Niagara Falls, like that
right.
far?
You're going from Niagara Falls all the way around the lake to Oshawa, and then up to Kitchener-Waterloo, all over, up to Barrie. And if you think about that area, and you say, okay, so how important is that area? Well, it's actually about 23% of the entire Canadian economy, and 23% of the entire Canadian population lives in this area. So I actually think that the government's efforts are prudent. We have seen home prices rising far more rapidly than the economic fundamentals would support. At the same time, if we went back 12 to 18 months ago, I actually wasn't worried about what was happening in the greater Golden Horseshoe area because it was really single detached home prices going up very rapidly relative to townhouses, condos, and it was a reflection of the fact we weren't building single detached homes and people want to raise kids in single detached homes. So there was a market effect driving the behavior. But then it broadened out, and then we had prices going up north of 25% for condos, for townhouses, the entire market, and then we saw it feed from the GTA out to Kitchener-Waterloo, and it was spreading around the Golden Horseshoe. And so as a consequence, what you could see was that this actually created a real economic risk. If we had a boom bust cycle in this region, it would have real economic consequences.
Well, the bust part anyway.
What you really want is a stable market over time that's good for buyers and for sellers and for the economy.
Let's look at rental housing here on that front, because we want to go through all of the different, or many of the different aspects of this plan. Sheldon, go ahead. Let's bring this graphic up. Here's from the Ottawa Citizen. The housing industry and some economists continue to insist that things work best when left to the market, and that any attempt at rent control will kill rental construction. But here's the thing. Developers had great incentive for 25 years to build and make the market work for renters, but that didn't happen in any meaningful way. Now that they're being held accountable, builders are predicting doom and gloom to get their way. Okay, Ben, coming at you. True or false?
Part of the reason that developers build rental housing is because it's profitable. all right? And what's more profitable right now? What's more profitable right now is building a condominium apartment. And part of the problem with the rental building is not necessarily the rental rates. That's certainly something that goes into it, but it's the financing of it, right? So you have to put a lot more into a rental building to get construction financing than you would a condominium. When we go for financing for a condominium, well, I've got 70% of the units sold. I have revenue certainty for the bank. They know that 70% of these units are selling at X amount of price. I can borrow against the deposits of those units, so I have to put less of my own money into the deal.
But let me jump in for a second. If the vacancy rate's 1%, you pretty much got guaranteed sellout in the rental accommodation as well, don't you?
Well, it depends on how much you paid for the land, depends on your construction costs, depends on the interest rate you're paying on that construction loan. So it's certainly not a slam dunk, and obviously we've seen a little bit of increase in the construction of rental lately, but not a huge amount. So obviously the numbers are still not working enough for to be an incentive for many developers to go.
If controls are on every project now, going forward as well, will we get any more rental construction in the province of Ontario, particularly in the GTHA?
You know, it's interesting. I was at the panelists on the Land and Development Conference yesterday, so I was asking everyone, and I heard of a major 3-building project, rental project that's now being shelved. So
where?
I can't say the actual developer, but it's in the Greater Toronto area. Okay. And so basically they're going back and running the condo numbers. So, and unfortunately, and some of them that I would say are already pregnant, guys that are already going with their rental projects, what they're doing now is shifting the mix of units. So instead of having those family-size units that people are going to stay in longer, they're going to switch those to smaller units because you get the greater turnover, and then you can raise the rents again when those people turn over.
Controls on everything now. Good or bad idea?
I think you'll often hear people that do what I do, with working with people that are lower income, say housing is a right. But what does that actually mean when we unpack it? At the moment, housing has been driven too much by the market. And so what we're seeing is that prices have been escalating. And condos have been built because they're more profitable than rental. I think what these controls will do now is finally dampen some of those dark market forces so that rental may be just as profitable. Land will continue to be an issue. There's just more of a scarcity of it. And the province has begun to address that by saying that they'll loosen up the land that they have under their control by looking at development charges and other things like that. That we do need to be thinking that how do we ensure that the people that are the education assistants in our schools or are serving our COVI can live within our community?
No, I hear you, but if he's right, and admittedly, evidence anecdotal at this stage, but if he's right that companies that are thinking about or were in the process of doing rental accommodation have now decided that because rent controls are going to be on everything, they're now not going to do that. How is that helpful for tenants?
I think
if you're not in. If you are in,
Indeed.
You're great. If you're not in yet, how does it help?
I think that's where the confusion happens, that rent control helps people that are already in place, and that's what we want to happen because that's the majority of people that are living. In terms of the new development of housing stock, that actually requires different policy solutions.
In other words,
rent control is not going to answer that.
Rent control is not going to help those who are looking for a place.
No, rent control protects people. That doesn't protect the stock. That's another set of questions.
And the example might be anecdotal that was given, but quite frankly, we've seen this in every market that rent controls have been applied. It creates supply problems. So it benefits those that are going to receive the rent control, but it distorts the future supply of buildings or rental properties coming on the market. And I think the Ontario government recognized that because they did have measures aimed at providing, reducing development costs on purpose-built rental units down the road. The problem is you're talking, $125 million over 5 years. It's not going to change the economics of.
That's not enough of an incentive.
It's probably not going to be enough of an incentive to make a really meaningful difference on the supply effect side of things. So from an economist point of view, the rent controls have a lot of intuitive appeal for people that are currently renters and are facing rising rents. And you have a lot of sympathy, the cost of living going up because of the cost of rents going up. But at the same time, if you think of a medium longer term view, rent controls distort the market and actually make it worse off for the rental market as a whole.
Cynthia, I heard a developer the other day say what was kind of an amusing line. If you want to destroy a city, either fly over it and drop a bomb on it or bring in rent controls. You agree?
Well, I've heard this, yes. I think that rent control fundamentally on the long term is not the most effective policy to help vulnerable families. The reason is that if we do think that housing is a right and that low-income families should be able to access good housing, we can't rely on for-profit developers to supply that government sort of benefit to them.
I'll agree with you there.
So what we need to do is we make sure that the developers have an opportunity to be successful to supply residential housing to the market, and then our vulnerable families we have to address in another way, some way so they can pay and they are somehow receiving income, for example, rent vouchers so that they can pay market rents somehow, or units that are delivered by governments that remain rent stable, or other incentives to developers to say, well, you can develop 10 more stories on your building if 3 of them have various rent control items on it. So I think that we can't rely on developers to supply low-income housing.
Can I just ask you that?
Or affordable housing.
Or affordable housing.
So you're both talking about a larger role for
Exactly, that's
government
right.
here. But I want to ask Ben, if developers were offered that last option, just described by Professor Holmes here, where you come in and say, fine, instead of a 7-story building, we'll let you do 10, but 3 of those floors have to be rent controlled, the rest go nuts.
Yeah, I mean,
Would they do that?
I've always been supportive of inclusionary housing if there's a trade-off there, right? So if I'm building a 40-story building and you give me 10 more floors, I'll put 5 in there that are affordable at the bottom. I mean, that makes sense for everyone. It's a win-win for everyone involved, or you push my application quicker through the process. So something that saves me money that I can now allocate that to affordable housing. I think it makes perfect sense instead of the province going out and trying to find their own sites and build their own buildings and manage that, completely separate that group of people, have them in right in the downtown core, use the expertise of the developers out there to save on cost, to save on trades, and to deliver that, that warm shell and provide the housing that we need for that group.
But Diane, absent this kind of more innovative thinking, I presume you're talking about a much more expensive and more involved role for government to create the kind of housing that it looks like the private sector is not going to do going forward with rent controls on everything now. Have I got that right?
I think the government has to figure out where can they put pressure on the market to ensure that the incentives are lined up right so that we can live in a city or in a province where everybody belongs. And then that's, I think, where the debates end up doing. What hasn't gotten addressed as well is the whole band of social housing that is now coming to the end of its
Lifespan.
Yeah, the repairs that are needed are incredible, and so I was a bit disappointed that we didn't see any movement there. But the pressure will continue around that. But in the meantime, then we do rely on the private market to be providing affordable housing. And when I say affordable housing, I mean that anybody that earns under the median income of a household income of about 48,000, you can correct me, that somebody can afford to live here. And so we're talking about half of this area's population. That's a lot of people that cannot afford the new $1 million homes that are for sale in my neighborhood.
Yeah, StatsCan came out with that the other day, right? The largest cohort of people living in Toronto are tenants, right? About 44%.
Yep. Yeah. And that's the wider geography of Toronto. In the city of Toronto, we've always had lots of towers around, but we're seeing intensification in Mississauga and all around the Horseshoe.
Okay, let's move on to the next area. You talked about this a second ago, so I'll give you the first kick at this. This is foreign buyers in Toronto. This is the new tax on non-resident home buyers. According to Toronto Real Estate Board, here we go, between 2008 and 2017, so basically over the last decade, the average share of foreign buyers in the Greater Golden Horseshoe was 2.3%. The majority of those buyers, between 87 and 90%, purchased their home as a place to live. In which case, go ahead, Cynthia, the non-resident speculation tax is going to have what kind of impact?
No impact. Well,
Seems
I think
like
a very minimal impact. If there's an impact, it's because people worry to themselves, well, should I sell my house? Maybe there's not going to be enough buyers. It will be sort of a secondary impact on it. But the fact is that most data that comes out, and I haven't seen the source of that data precisely, but it does seem like the Toronto players, the foreign speculators, are just not a large part of the market.
Craig, one of the things that confused me was that if you think speculation is bad, I'm not sure, if it's evil, I'm not sure why it's only evil when non-residents do it, but when local people do it, it's okay. So what is the value in putting a spec tax on non-residents only as opposed to everybody?
Well, I think the economic rationale is, we're talking about people who are not invested in the local economy. They're not living here, working here, contributing to the local economy, paying taxes here.
But if you just buy a place to flip it a month later, how exactly is that contributing to the local economy?
Well, the person's living there, and if the person makes income off that property, then they're going to spend money in that economy.
But they're not living there. That's the point. If
No,
they
no, no.
buy a place and flip it a month later before moving in, how is that contributing anything to anything?
But if that person is actually living in the province and is flipping properties and getting income out of it, it might be inflating prices, but that person is in the domestic economy.
Gotcha.
Or cynically,
But if we talk about the impact that this is going to have, right? We don't actually have good data on non-resident purchases of real estate in the local marketplace.
We have good anecdotal data. I can name the houses on my blog where it's happened. So what the province at least has done is they kicked open the door and said that, and we're setting up a group to look at a local tax for local tax.
And I think this is a first step measure, right? So if this doesn't work, the province will probably start thinking about, okay, maybe we should broaden this out to speculators across the market.
What do you
they said
mean?
they
What do you
will.
mean if it doesn't
They
work?
look
How
at
do you know if it works?
Well, you'll see a cooling in price behavior.
Not if it's only 3% of the sales in the city.
Well, so the government number that they're quoting is around 8. They think it's around 8%. The Ipsos Reid did a survey. They said it was around 5%. The TREB numbers say it's like 2 to 3%. It isn't a big part of the market, but also remember that from an economic point of view, the price for the unit is set by the final bidder. So in point of fact, even if it's only 3% of the market or 5% of the market, that actually has a greater impact on setting the price because those are the individuals that are actually paying the higher price, right? So their price effect might be larger. And we did see in Vancouver that after the foreign buyer tax was applied, you did have a drop in activity. You did see a drop in foreign purchases of real estate in the marketplace. But as I said at the start, I actually think this is one of those things that has a short-term effect. The market will, after about 6 months, it'll basically sort out and go back to, okay, well, how attractive is real estate in Toronto? Wow, it's still attractive. So I think that this is a measure that's going to have some short-term impact and limited impact. But the other point is it's a psychological one, which we've already heard in terms of domestic buyers saying, whoa, wait a second, let's see what happens with these measures before I go and place a property on. I think we're seeing that in Vancouver, right? Initially, there was a psychological impact of domestic sellers. Now, that impact is starting to wane as they're realizing.
Tell me, you said a second ago, if we were going to be cynical about this.
yes, if we're going to be, in response to your question, why are we targeting foreign buyers, foreign speculators and not domestics? The cynical reason
we're going to study
right.
local.
Well, the cynical reason is because foreign buyers don't vote, right? Because they're outsiders, and there's also something reassuring about blaming our problems on foreigners and outsiders. And it would be lovely if we could just say it's somebody else doing that.
I thought Liberals didn't do that. I thought they didn't.
Well, I don't know. That's my cynical view.
Stigmatize
That's
foreigners.
my unnatural cynical state. I don't know.
How useful do you think this is going to be?
I don't think it's going to have a huge impact. I've said for the longest time, part of what's inflating our market is foreign capital, but not necessarily foreign buyers, right? I look at the agreement of purchase and sale on all our projects, and it might have 3 or 4 foreign buyers on there, but a lot of the buyers that come into the sales office, they're recent immigrants. They live in Unionville, they live in Markham, they live in Richmond Hill, but they have relatives in another country, and they're giving them money to go buy real estate. They fundamentally believe in real estate as an investment asset class. They've seen the prices go up, for 20 consecutive years in the GTA marketplace. They compare the values in Toronto to other global cities and say, okay, Hong Kong's $3,500 a square foot. New York's $4,000 a square foot. Toronto's $800 a square foot, right? Just makes sense that Toronto would arise and go up to those levels eventually. So what a better place to put your money.
Can somebody help me with this? And I'm probably wrong on this, so educate the host here for a second. Every time there's a house sale, there's a land transfer tax that's paid, right?
Yes.
The municipality gets that tax, right?
There's the municipality and the province.
And the province.
There's 2.
So it is financially not in the interest of either government in terms of their revenues to dampen down this kind of activity because presumably they profit on it, their coffers profit every time the market goes nuts. So anybody want to explain to me why they would want to tamp down on this?
Homeowners benefit in the sense that my house is making a ton of money because I purchased earlier.
The only people who don't benefit are the people who are trying to get in.
That's
but the government's benefit, the homeowners who sell benefit, the people who buy benefit because they're getting their place, So why is this happening exactly?
So this is the balance of political debate versus an economic debate, and governments have to straddle both worlds.
So it's all politics, frankly.
No.
No, go ahead, explain.
If there's a boom-bust cycle in the real estate market, it's going to hurt government revenues in an enormous way, right? So ultimately, the way I view these measures is they're not dramatic, but they're a gentle tap on the brakes to try and slow things down. And what we saw in the United States, and I don't think that there's really strong parallels between the housing behavior in Canada and the United States or the risks, but it's illustrative of the fact that if you have a large collapse in the housing market, the single biggest asset that people have, you are going to have significant economic consequences from it. So from a government policy point of view, giving up a little revenue now in order to reduce the risk of a big swing in tax revenue down the road actually makes an awful lot of economic sense.
Craig, that's why we invited you here today, because that I needed to understand better. Okay, good. Moving on. Next part of the so-called fair housing plan, vacant homes tax. Cynthia, you want to explain how this works? Vacant home tax.
So if you own a unit and you have nobody occupying that unit, then you have an extra tax that you have to pay. And it was implemented recently in Vancouver, and you're starting to see now the media in Vancouver saying, hey, you better rent your house soon if it's vacant, because you have to have your tenants in for at least 6 months. Otherwise, at the end of the year, you report, I had a vacant unit, and you're subject to a particular tax.
Now again, explain to me why you would own a second property and leave it empty. Why would you do that?
Well, I would say it's a speculator who has decided, for reasons that don't exactly seem rational to me, to not rent it out. So perhaps they're holding it in the hopes that over time their rents will grow in a way so that it's more advantageous to rent it later. Or they plan to flip it quickly, so they're not going to put a tenant in there to keep it vacant for that reason. But then the tax will capture a lot of people who, for example, live and work sometime in Montreal and sometime in Toronto, and so they actually have two households, or a married couple where they have jobs temporarily. People who have second homes as vacation properties. So a lot of people will be captured, and they have a vacant home because they use it sometime for their own use as well.
Gotcha.
This is a duplication or a recognition of a similar policy move that the government just made a few months ago, looking at commercial properties, where they also have just given local municipalities the chance to tax empty storefronts. And that change came because a lot of stores were sitting there empty. In fact, they were getting tax rebates under the current property tax structure to leave them empty. If you weren't able to rent it out within 3 months, you got 30% off your property taxes. And so if you inherited a building and just didn't want to have to deal with the mess of a tenant or something like that, you didn't have to. So the province has given the power to local municipalities to begin to reverse that. And I'm talking to economic development departments in small towns around the province as they think through what can we do with this recovered tax. And I'm happy to see that same thinking about how having a vacant building hurts our communities, whether it's residential or commercial.
Does this tax bite enough, in your view, to change the behavior of those owners who left those places vacant and encourage them enough to fill it?
I don't think so. I mean, I don't think it's a problem in the first place. I think, we're just simply following what Vancouver did because people think it's going to work. I certainly don't see it. I mean, I talked to a lot of realtors and they don't see it. I mean, renting a place out is free money, essentially. And if you're worried that your tenant's going to destroy your property, it's a lot cheaper to just get more insurance than it is to not get the rent in there, right? So, I think maybe they're trying to cut down on maybe Airbnbs because that's been disruptive in some downtown condominium buildings in terms of partying and unknown people coming in and out of the lobby. So I think that's certainly something that they want to push down a little bit as well.
Craig, how would you begin as a government to enforce something like this?
Well, you just found the flaw in the plan, right? So the concept of saying, okay, we're going to tax vacant homes so that we encourage people to rent them out to increase rental supply. I mean, sounds like a perfectly good idea. You're providing an incentive structure to achieve a goal. Problem is, how do you operationalize it, right? How do you actually implement a vacant property tax? The person that has the vacant property doesn't really have a big incentive to self-report that they have a vacant property. Many might, but some are going to hope the government doesn't notice that it's vacant. This is why in some regions that have implemented, some cities that have implemented this, basically you end up using a snitch line. I'm not actually sure well-crafted policy is designed around having neighbors snitch on each other, right? So I think that the concept has merit in terms of an incentive structure, right? So putting a tax on vacant properties, we don't actually know what the tax is going to be, right? Because all the government said was, they're going to allow the city of Toronto and any other urban center that wants to put a tax on vacant property to do so. So they're giving the power to the city to do this. But we don't know yet what the proposed tax rate is going to be or how it's going to be monitored. You might use utilities. You can look at electricity, water usage to try and gauge, well, is that property vacant or not? But you're only going to get that information with a bit of a lag as well. So
I'm trying to imagine, is the city actually going to send inspectors out all over the city to knock on doors and find out if anybody's living there so they can see if it's vacant
That would
or
be
not?
crazy, and I think that's what we're going to do with the tax revenue is set up the structures to enforce the collection of the tax revenue. So it seems like the costs of enforcement would be so high that it's a revenue neutral sort of thing in the end.
But I do think it's an issue because I know that I was looking at this issue a number of years ago in my own neighborhood where I've lived for 20 years.
Which is where? Which neighborhood?
Little India. So it's the neighborhood that is gentrified so much that a recent real estate video of the neighborhood didn't show any of the Indian restaurants except for the one with tablecloths. So we've had a lot of market forces happening about what's going on in our neighborhood. But I was able to list about 12 different houses that I knew that were empty. Sometimes it was because the older generation had moved on, kids hadn't decided what to do with it. Sometimes it was that somebody had bought a second house and they stored all their things in it. There was another house in our neighborhood that had 12 cats and dogs living in it.
So here's the question. You going to call
It's
the snitch
open.
line?
I actually do think that probably pushing it down to the municipal level makes a lot of sense, that the municipal government can track things like where does the property tax bill get sent.
So are you going
Yeah.
to call the snitch line? I noticed you dodged that. Anyway.
Only if they're really rotten neighbors, but no, I'm not a
If the
snitch.
cats go crazy. Okay, let's move on to our next one here. This is, supply and demand. We got to cover this, obviously. Here's Cherise Berta from the Ryerson City Building Institute writing in the Globe and Mail. When considering the supply side, the issue is housing supply, not land supply. According to the Neptus Foundation, there is no shortage of land on which to build ground-related houses for decades to come. Rather, housing starts are being delayed due to costs and approvals and other barriers to servicing greenfield land, including building and connecting the infrastructure such as water and sewerage. Okay, Ben, true or false?
That's true. Yeah, I mean we're getting totally delayed by not having a sewage plant built in a certain area, not connecting the main trunk lines up to these new areas. And so you've seen it. You've seen, 15 years ago there was 17,000 new, what I would call ground-related housing units for sale. If you went to all the sales offices across the Greater Toronto area, as of last month, it was 932 units. So 67% decrease year over year, and we've seen, new home prices go up 30% year over year. It's really just a supply and demand problem, and I don't think there's any incentive for the municipalities to rush these things because of the Places to Grow Act and how much intensification they need to build. So it's essentially building within the built boundary already. Right?
I want to be sure I'm clear on this because you seem to be confirming a canard I hear all the time, which is because of the Greenbelt and because of other land use policy issues, there's just not enough land out there for us to build supply on, and that's what's causing part of the problem. You're agreeing land isn't the problem,
There is land.
approvals is the
There
problem.
is land, but some of it's not within the urban boundary, so we can't build on it yet, right? And some of it that is within the urban boundary, there's not the services or there's not the incentive for the municipalities to get them approved in a reasonable amount of time. So that's why we've seen the market, major decrease in the number of units that are being brought to market, and that's essentially distorting the housing market in terms of values.
Land versus serviceable land versus, where are you on all this?
I guess I'm the softie on this panel, so I want to see the green belt protected. And so when I look at what's getting built at the edges of our cities, it is the single detached homes, the family homes, sort of by the Canadian dream. And I don't know that that's the answer that we as a society should be doing at all. In fact, we should be looking at more intensification. So the proposals to allow backyard housing, the granny suites in our backyards and things like that make much more sense in terms of building a strong community, a sustainable sustainable community. I understand that there's a push to go out into the Greenland because probably it's a more profitable place to sell in some ways.
It's gorgeous.
The
Who wouldn't
land is
wanna live
cheaper.
there? Yeah.
People will buy into it. But we really need to step back and think, how do we live so that people can afford to live downtown in a sustainable way?
Cynthia?
I think that it really does take a long time for developers to get from raw green land, get it serviced, get it approved, and get it so that housing is delivered. This time frame is really, really long, years and years and years. And so anything we can do to speed up that process would deliver more supply to the market. I'm not persuaded we need to dig into the green zone. I'd also think that there's a lot of value to maintaining it if possible. But if anything we can do to streamline these processes, and the Fair Housing Plan does make some reference to this sort of activity, I think would benefit our supply-demand imbalance that we have now.
In which case, we got a little over 5 minutes to go here. Let's throw some ideas on the table here. All of you off the top said, to greater or lesser extents, the package that the province put forward over the past week may do something, but probably won't do a heck of a lot to tamp down housing prices here, and we can probably expect in the future the increases to continue to pile up. In which case, let's hear some other ideas. Craig, what's a better idea than anything you've heard so far?
Well, first of all, I actually support the measures the government did as a first step because, I think that there is an imbalance in home prices in the greater Golden Horseshoe area. I have been worried that it isn't supported by economic fundamentals. The one thing you don't want to do when you have an imbalance is actually cause the correction.
Right. I don't want to run out of time here. So that's a good first step. What's a better second step?
If we continue to see home price growth in the double digits, I would recommend broadening out the suites of policies to lean against speculation. I'd increase the land transfer tax and then rebate it after 2 years or something like that, so that basically you tax people that are going to be flipping properties.
Gotcha. Ben?
Yeah, I was always supportive of a short-term flippers tax. Get those short-term people out of the market. If investors are buying to rent them out long-term, that's fine. That's a short-term solution.
What's short-term for you?
Short-term is less than 18 months, I think. If someone's flipping within 18 months, 2 years, put an additional tax on them. The other long-term solution, I think, is infrastructure. It's building transit. Allow people to move into these areas that we deem are not as valuable. You can still afford a fairly, cheap house in areas of North Etobicoke and Scarborough, but people are, they don't want to live there, or they just can't get to their job easily from those areas. If we build the transit to those areas, it creates value in those lands. Developers will go there. They'll build the high density that we need to save some of that future greenfield lands for the future.
I have one word: Hamilton.
Hamilton.
Go to Hamilton. Hamilton's fantastic.
We love Hamilton.
Great
we love
city.
Hamilton.
Going to be linked up by rail. Anyway,
It's the new
way
Brooklyn,
cheaper.
right?
Way cheaper. It's the new Brooklyn. You got it. Way cheaper.
But it's closing the gap rapidly because Hamilton's had some of the fastest home price growth in the Golden Horseshoe for several years. But I would stress again, ultimately the long-term solution here is supply. Right. So we need something to cool off the market now, but ultimately the solution to this is increasing supply to meet market demand.
Demand is not going to decrease. Toronto's going to continue to be an attractive place and people will be moving here. We need responses from government that allow supply to be delivered more quickly and more effectively.
And I would add in finally then that it has to be across the spectrum because people that have been living at the low end of the rent spectrum have been having a hard time for a decade. Where it's gotten public attention now is because suddenly middle-class kids aren't being able to live in the neighborhoods where they grew up. Yeah. But this is not a new problem for many people. And so we also want to think about the things such as all the loss of rooming houses, the hotel conversions where people are being exited so that they can be spruced up, and other sorts of things that if the government's going to go forward, they have to remember we need a full spectrum of housing. That is not just a market-driven thing.
Okay, in which case, we heard Ben's idea there. We've got to get some of the regulations out of the way. We've got to get faster approvals. We've got to let people who want to build so that they can get those homes to market. Give us another idea. What's going to increase the supply of housing for the 50,000 people who move into this region every year?
I'm actually just looking at trying to protect the stock that's already there and that's being lost regularly, as opposed to even creating it. The people that live at the lowest end of the rent spectrum are getting pushed entirely out of the GTA.
But I presume you'd love to see some kind of $1 billion social housing project that would just up supply dramatically.
I would love that, but I'd also like to make sure that we're protecting the stock that's even there. Social housing that we currently have is being depleted. So we're actually facing a whole other set of problems at the lower end of the rent market than what high-end marketers are facing in terms of supply.
Was there anything in the Ontario budget to deal with that backlog of maintenance on, for example, Toronto Community Housing Corporation homes?
Here I have to side with John Tory. We are looking for more
I
injections
think the
of
answer
funds.
you're saying is no, which may explain why
Yeah.
the mayor and the premier are having such a rough time these days.
Indeed.
You want
It
to
was a
take the last?
disappointment.
It was a disappointment.
It was a disappointment.
You want to take the last 30 seconds on how we can up supply?
Up supply, streamline the approval processes, increase the serviceable lots, make sure infrastructure is in place, and do everything we can to support builders in creating a wide spectrum from single-family detached to intense condos to rental housing across the property types.
Any of that happening right now?
There's some measures. There's some
Some.
measures. Things like small measures, development charges, for example, development charge rebates, and other small measures that are steps in the right direction. So it's encouraging.
I feel so much better educated on all of this right now. Thank you, everybody. Craig Alexander for coming in from the Conference Board of Canada, Diane Dyson, Wood Green Community Services, Cynthia Holmes, Ryerson University, Ben Myers, Fortress Real Developments. Great to see all of you again at TVO tonight. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Help TVO create a better world through the power of learning. Visit TVO.org and make a tax-deductible donation today.